Looks like we are live. Yeah, I've got volume. Hi everybody and welcome. My name is Saxon. Today is Camera Basics. Switch over to that. We'll be starting in about 5 minutes for anybody watching online. So 5 minutes and then we'll start our class. Alright, well, we've waited a good amount of time. I think anybody will join in. We got another minute, but we'll start this guy up. Hello, welcome to Camera Basics. I'm Saxon. So really today we're going to be going through the very basics for camera understanding. I like to start it off by teaching people about automatic, making sure we're comfortable with that. We go over a layout of the camera. Now everyone's camera will differ a little bit. I see a point and shoot model, I see DSLR, I see mirrorless cameras. For the most part I just see mirrorless and point and shoot models, if I'm not mistaken. So we'll go through all of that. Some of it will pertain to the DSLR world, but for the most part of everything, mirrorless, point and shoot models, they all have the same buttons and configurations, they've just got them in different places. So if you don't know where it's at or you're having trouble finding the buttons as we talk about it, just let me know and then I can kind of show you. But getting into it, really what's happening here is we're trying to graduate from our smartphone. So we have a smartphone, we've taken pictures on there, but now the question is, where do you go from there? Obviously, before phones were invented, how did we take pictures? We've been doing it for, I believe, almost 200 years now at this point for image image taking, if not a little less than that, or yeah, a little less than that. But to start everything off, so we'll go through the beginning of the slide. So where to go for help when all else fails. My class is great. I give you the very basics for what you need, but it's always important. I recommend start with your owner's manual, read through that guy, understand everything about your camera, what Canon, Nikon, Sony, what are they offering you towards whatever the camera is that you're getting. Another good one I really like is Imaging Resource. I had a customer actually put me onto this. They have a podcast too, which is just below that. The podcast is very nerdy as far as camera gear goes. They get very spec oriented. They talk about every little detail on a camera. But if you're looking for something that'll help you with the vocabulary, understand cameras a little bit better, that's a great resource to go to. Canon's website, Nikon's website, and Sony's website are fantastic. They have so much information on there, whether it be about focal length, understanding the products that they carry, or even how they stack up compared to their competitors. It's really awesome. And then YouTube is the last one. If you can't find it on YouTube, then you're probably not looking it up right. Every major fix in my house that I have to do, I YouTube it first before I attempt to do anything. Just replaced my entire bathroom the other month, and I ripped everything out of it, learned it all on YouTube. It was pretty great. So going from there, first thing we talk about is SD cards and storage. Anybody who has used a camera before, or if you're brand new to cameras, you're not going to have any storage with your current camera. So any camera that you buy nowadays, it will give you no storage. And the reason they do that is because everybody shoots a little bit differently with their camera. You could be using a JPEG, but you might be using a higher quality JPEG image or a lower quality JPEG image. You might be shooting on RAW as well too. That we really don't talk about until the advanced class, but there's a lot of different ways and methods you can save the photo. By doing that, it takes up a different amount of storage space. It also requires maybe a little bit faster of what they call a read and write speed. And those are all important details to be looking at with an SD card. But you want to make sure you have two SD cards, because in the reality of things, when you put an SD card into the camera, majority of the time, I'd say 95% of the time it'll work, but there's that 5% of time when you put the SD card in there and your camera, when it turns on, gives you a warning message saying that there's no SD card in there. There's not much you can really do about that. You can take the SD card out, try blowing on it, putting it back in, but sometimes it fails. So it's always important, if you're going out and shooting for the day, I always recommend having two of these SD cards. It's a good option. If you're just shooting photos, 32 to 64 gigabytes is going to be more than enough. 64 gigabyte with, let's say, a 20 megapixel camera, which is, I would say, probably the standard or middle tier for cameras, that's probably going to save you a little under 10,000 photos, about 9,000. If you're on vacation, you're gone for 2 weeks, that 9,000 might stack up really quickly, so 128 would be great. But regardless, making sure that you have the correct amount of storage based on what your shoot is going to be is important, depending on what you're doing. Your picture should never just live on your memory card. The idea of a memory card is it's basically a boat to get from one place to the other. Camera is your first area that you're going to. That's where you're taking the initial pictures, but then you need to move them to somewhere else. So a lot of people, they like to keep their photos on there. They hold on to SD cards. They buy multiple. You can do that, but an SD card is a very thin piece of plastic. It's very flimsy too. Chances of it breaking are much higher. So I definitely recommend that they shouldn't live on the memory card, but if that is one way you'd like to save them, by all means. But you should have a multitude of them. So this is my list for how I like to save my images on my camera. First thing I'm going to do is I turn the camera off and I wait about 5 seconds. If you turn your camera off and you just hold it to your ear, you can actually hear everything on the inside of the camera powering down. That's the sensor cleaning itself off. That's the camera saving all of its images and going through its final process. That's basically everything booting down and saving properly. So you want to make sure you at least wait a few seconds before popping anything out of your camera. Once you've waited that little bit, you can go ahead and remove the card. Depending on the camera style that you have, the SD card is going to be located in one of two places. It's either going to be next to your battery, so where the battery is, you'll open up that housing. Next to the battery, you'll see the slot for the SD card. On other cameras, on DSLRs and mirrorless, some of the more advanced models, you're going to see a second compartment on the side of your camera. That's where your SD card will be located. Now, also depending, you might have 1 to 2 different spots for an SD card. Most cameras are going to have 1, some will have 2, and some will even have 1 for your standard SD card and 1 for a more advanced SD card. Right now we're only focusing on that main SDXC card. Once you've taken the card out of the camera, place it into a reader. Now, I put another line under there to try to avoid using your camera to transfer photos to your device. There's 2 schools of thought. I personally like to remove the card and put it into a card reader. You avoid the chances of you damaging the camera or then losing your photos as you transfer over. The way I think about it is that the camera being plugged into the computer is just another connection that you have going on. And what can happen is let's say the camera becomes unplugged while you're transferring, you spill water on the camera while it's transferring. Not only do you risk damaging your camera, but you also risk losing all those images that you're trying to transfer over. So my recommendation is always to remove the card physically from the camera first and insert the card into the computer. That way you're avoiding any then transmission issues between the camera and the computer. Now, a lot of these cameras are going to have Wi-Fi and Bluetooth built into them, and that's an awesome feature to use, and I definitely recommend it. Whatever your camera brand is, I would Google what the app is associated with that. Sony uses SnapBridge, if I'm not mistaken. Canon has a Canon app. I believe it's just called a Canon app. And then Nikon also has an app too. They're all going to let you do one of 2 things. They're going to let you transfer everything from the camera to the phone, or they're going to allow you to use it as a remote. So you can use your phone to remote control your camera. If you want to set a timer up, if you want to do burst settings, if you want to put the camera somewhere, back up, and then check to see what it looks like without your camera being in front of you, you can use the phone for that reason. My only qualm with that is that by doing it, you're reducing the battery life on the physical camera. If you've got maybe like 10 or 15 photos you want to transfer to your phone, maybe to send out to friends and family, let them know you're safe, or here's what I'm seeing today, that's awesome. But if you've got like 50 plus photos to transfer, you're better plugging it into the computer. For the images quality, but then also just for your camera battery, if you're doing a longer shoot, you could chop your camera battery life down by 20%. So keep that in mind as you're transferring photos and thinking about that. But once that card reader, or once you remove that card and you put it into a card reader, you're getting ready, use a good card reader. Use maybe an older one that you have at home, but I definitely recommend going the card reader route. Avoid plugging your camera in, avoid that extra connection, so just to minimize any chance of error. These are different variations of card readers, and if I'm being honest, that one in the middle that's a stick, that's my personal favorite. It's the Trifecta. It's number 1, the cheapest one that I know that we sell, but then 2, it's got a USB-A and a USB-C. Most computers will still have USB-A on there, but now Mac especially, a lot of them are pushing to only having that USB-C on the side. So keep that in mind as you're looking either at new laptops or card readers or whatever have you in the camera world. These are what typical card readers will look like today, whether you're looking at a third-party brand or an OEM brand like Sony, Canon, or Nikon. So one of the next things I like to do with the photos is I don't want to physically move them, I want to copy them. And for the same reason that we've been talking about with plugging your camera into the computer and transferring, you want to minimize the chances for any errors. So by copying your photos over, you're keeping them in the same place that they were. You're just making a duplicate of them in another location. So let's say that the camera or the SD card does become unplugged. Now you at least know that the photos were saved somewhere else. They're still there. They're just being copied over to a second location. So you're minimizing the chances of if something does go wrong, you have a backup to the photos that you're trying to move over. Depending on who you're using, depending on who you're using, if you're on Windows, you're using Explorer, and if you're on Mac, you're using the Finder. That's how you're going to find where your photos are. Once you put the SD card into the computer, I definitely would recommend renaming your SD card. It'll make it easier to find. If you're only using one type of camera, maybe label it that camera model. If you have multiple SD cards, maybe label it the SD card and gigabyte size that you're using, so that way you don't get things confused. Whatever's going to be your easiest way of remembering where you're putting the photos. Lastly, copy your photos to another place. So this is one that I can't stress enough. through college, I went to the School of the Art Institute downtown. I had so many people that would lose all of their work, their images, their drawings, all because they spilled some water on their laptop or because they left something at home. It can get really tricky. And when you're dealing with a lot of photos, thousands of images collected over many years of using a camera, not only would I recommend saving them to your computer, but you should be using one of these other locations. So an external hard drive of some sort. You can buy an external 1 terabyte drive for like 80 bucks, even 50, 60 bucks if you want to look for a cheaper one on Amazon. That's a great way of storing your photos in 2 places. Cloud computing is super big nowadays. If you have a Gmail, you automatically have Google Drive for free. If you have an Amazon account, you have a Prime Photo account, which means you can store photos and files onto either of those 2, and then you can access them anywhere in the world that you're at. So if you don't like having physical drives and you don't want to have any extra hardware, using a cloud-based solution is a great way for storing your photos in more than one location. So you have backups to your backups in case you lose stuff. The last step within making sure that you get your pictures, eject your card physically before removing it. So on the left or right hand of your screen, you should be able to click on the bottom portion and you'll get a little pop-up to eject the card. If you're on Mac, you can actually just click and drag the card to the trash can. That'll eject everything. And then you have 2 different options for deformatting the card. You can delete everything while it's still on the computer. That's the most simple way of doing it. Select all the images after you've transferred everything to the computer. Drag it to the trash can. That'll delete everything on the card and then it's ready to go. But my personal recommendation is to format the card. So put the card back into the camera. You go into the camera's menu system and then you're able to format the card. This will not only erase everything on the card, but it'll prime the card so that way when you take a photo, let's say that photo takes 205 megabytes, it's going to make sure that that photo takes exactly 205 megabytes and it spaces the card out so that it optimizes the storage. In the long run of things, it might give you 2 extra photos on there, but it's worth it if you only have a 32 or 16 gigabyte SD card. So again, you've moved everything onto your computer. Your 2 options I would recommend would be either to format the card inside the camera or delete everything while it's still on the computer and then put the card back into your camera. So again, kind of going over everything, your SD card is your primary way that you're getting the photo. I recommend having 2 of them so that way just in case one fails when you're out on a shoot, you've got a second one ready to go. After you've taken all your pictures, your goal is to get them onto the computer. You can either do one of 2 options. You plug the SD card into the physical computer or you wire in your camera to then send the photos in. Both are going to transfer the same way. I just recommend doing with the SD card so you minimize the chance of either damaging your camera or damaging the photos as they transfer in. And then the other 2 options, your backup plan, are either going to be your hard drive or your cloud-based solution. 1 terabyte hard drive, you can even find 500 gigabyte hard drives, which will cost less. You can even go crazy and get a 5 terabyte, a 2 terabyte, I think they even have 10 terabytes for $1,000. From there, you can either just stick with that, or you can also use a cloud-based solution, or you can just do a cloud-based solution. So something like Google Drive, Prime Photos. So in this case, I give a couple different options. Google Drive on the left, I would say that's one of the most popular. If you have a Gmail account, which is free, then you automatically have Google Drive. OneDrive, a lot of people have Microsoft for work. They have Outlook as their email. Outlook automatically gives you the OneDrive, which is their version of cloud-based solution. And my personal favorite is the Adobe Creative Cloud. I like this one because it's a membership you pay, but you also get access to all of the Creative Cloud apps. So InDesign, Photoshop, Lightroom. If you're even remotely interested, I think they have a trial of some sorts that gets you for like a week. But from there, you also get a cloud-based solution to save all of your photos and your images to it. So not only do you get the editing side, but then you also get the solution to save all of your work and stuff. So definitely another one that's good to look at. Now let's go through a tour of your camera. Again, everyone's camera is going to look a little bit different, but these are the same buttons that you're going to see throughout all different camera models. If there's a button that you see on there you'd like either further explanation or you want to find it on yours, let me know. Some of the cameras, and Canon specifically has done this, they've moved a lot of the buttons to the inside menu program for the camera. So if you don't see a button on the physical camera, most likely it's inside the menu. And all of your Canon should be touch control, so you should be able to touch through as well too. So first thing first, what is the difference between mirrorless and DSLR? Why does it matter? Why should you care? DSLRs basically replaced your SLRs. Back in, I would say, the late 90s, mid-90s, camera companies started coming out with a way of capturing the image that didn't require film. It would use a sensor on the inside of the camera. That then was going to record the image. In a very similar way that SLRs worked, light comes in, bounces off of a mirror, and hits what they call a pentaprism. It could be another mirror depending on the model that you have. That pentaprism basically then reflects the image back and into an image sensor. The image sensor then shows you on the opposite side, so when you take that image, you look down and your LCD screen shows you what you did. Mirrorless does the same exact thing, except it minimizes the fact that it doesn't need the mirrors anymore. So now light cuts through and it hits the image sensor. The image sensor then processes the image and then throws it right onto the LCD screen, and you see everything that's going through. Back in the day, with the DSLRs, you'd also have what's called an optical viewfinder. The light would then come through, and when you looked up at the viewfinder of your camera, even if the camera was turned off, you could see right through the camera. Nowadays, it comes through an electric viewfinder. Now, other things to look at too on there is you can see the DSLR body is much thicker than the mirrorless body, as well the DSLR, which is on the right side, that's the Canon, versus the mirrorless, which is Sony, is significantly larger. So big things you're missing out on with the DSLR versus mirrorless: it weighs less, it doesn't have the mirror on there, and it's smaller. Benefits, though, is that the mirrorless technology at a certain point definitely wasn't anywhere near DSLRs. I'd say within the last 10-20 years, Sony specifically has really taken mirrorless and made it much better. They've really made it their pioneer and their flagship. At the current moment, Sony only makes mirrorless. But from there, brands like Canon and now Nikon have adapted mirrorless and made it even better. So at the current moment, I believe Canon sits at #1 with their RF series. The R series from Canon is considered as one of the #1 right now. Sony gets ranks as #2, also kind of teetering on #1. Sony's very famous for their video, and Nikon is kind of at the bottom right now, but they're slowly making their way back to the top. They were not making mirrorless for a long time. They then went into mirrorless. They were the last ones in, and now their Z8, which is one of their flagship models, is really popular. That and their Z9. But the big things that you're getting on the mirrorless versus the mirrored is that it's #1 going to be lighter because you don't have that mirror in there. The image response time is going to be about the same. So the amount of time that it takes for the camera to process on a DSLR versus a mirrorless, it's almost instantaneous nowadays. So the wait time or the amount of latency that you would have between the two is almost non-existent. And then #3, I would say the big thing is people would say that the quality of a DSLR, because of the mirror and the way that it's capturing the image, is much more finer and refined than the mirrorless. At this point nowadays, the mirrorless can get things that the mirrored can't. I would say mirrorless is going to be far superior. It's going to weigh a lot less, and at the long run of things, it should last you longer than your DSLR is, because the mirror on the DSLRs can be fragile. It can be a little bit timid. Sometimes it can get popped up and stuck too, and that's a whole different headache. So at the current moment, mirrorless is the way of the future. That's the way that you're going to see most cameras go nowadays, until the next thing that replaces mirrorless. But at the current moment, mirrorless is king. So starting with your camera, if you look at the top view, this should be how your camera from the top kind of viewpoint looks. So on your camera, you're going to see a red dot somewhere. That's going to be your video start and stop button. When you're recording video, or when you want to record video, if you're on the automatic setting for your camera and you press this button, it should automatically start recording a video for you, and the camera will either beep or it'll show a light indication somewhere on the screen or on the side of the camera. It's usually a red flashing light showing you that you've began your recording. If you don't have a red dot, it might also be a little red circle as well too. The power switch is just around there too. Power switch is going to be your on and off button, and typically the power switch is somewhere around your shutter release button. Your shutter release button is going to be the button at which your shutters are going to open and then close. That's going to be your image capture button. Underneath that, you'll have exposure compensation. Now, exposure compensation and ISO are usually put in a similar category. ISO controls the amount of light that your camera is intaking as a whole. The way I can compare that is if you ever looked at your film would say like Kodak 100, Kodak 400. ISO has the same numbers that correspond to film. So ISO, it has a long name. I always get it confused. I'm not going to try to say it. But it refers to film and the sensitivity that film would have towards light. Nowadays, ISO is the sensitivity of your sensor. So it's how sensitive, how much light your sensor is bringing in. So you can have your ISO running at a very high number, you can have it running at a very low number. That's going to equate to grain and noise. That's stuff that we talk about in the intermediate class. But exposure compensation allows you to alter how much light or darkness is coming on the entire image itself. So if you have an exposure compensation button or a dial for it, if you turn it up all the way into the pluses, it'll start getting lighter. And if you turn it down into the negatives, it'll bring your image down darker. It's a quick way of changing light and dark depending on the situation that you're in. If you're maybe running on auto ISO or you're doing anything else on the camera automatically, it's an easy way of playing with the light without having to play with too much inside the camera. Underneath that, you have your mode dial. I like to think of this as like the PEMDAS or the Prindle dial on the car. This is your way of either going into reverse, drive, neutral, what have you. For this class, and at the very end, you'll see I recommend stick with auto for now, especially if this is your first camera. That's either going to be symbolized with a green camera symbol, a green auto, or what might be said as AI on there, which would be intelligent auto or auto intelligent. But your mode dial is going to be your main driver for the camera. That's going to decide what setting or what mode that the camera is in itself. Underneath that, you have a live view switch. Now this might be a switch toggle or this might be a button on there, but live view is going to dictate whether or not you are looking through your viewfinder or your LCD screen. If you do have it switched and your screen isn't turning on, that means that your viewfinder is only on and your screen is blacked out. Some people think their camera's broken because of this. They're like, I don't understand why I can only look through the viewfinder and not the screen. Most likely you just got to press the live view button again and then it'll go back to normal. So then your screen will turn on, but then you can also use your viewfinder if you choose. It's a nice way of saving battery. That's why they do it that way. So you might get an extra 1,000 shots out of your camera for the day versus if you had the screen running the whole time, then the battery goes down a little bit faster. Now the command dial underneath that. So depending on the setting that you're on in your camera, if you're on automatic, it will do nothing. But if you are on manual, that's going to allow you to control the shutter or the ISO. If you are on the shutter priority, it's going to control the shutter speed. If you are on the aperture priority, it's going to control the aperture. So depending on the mode that you are on, your command dial will then give you control of changing the numbers on there. Do you need a faster or slower shutter speed? Do you need to allow more light into the camera or less light into the camera? Depending on the setting, then the command dial comes into play. So the command dial really functions off of the mode dial. Those two go hand in hand. This is the slide I was referring to. So start with auto. This is the easiest way to get into the camera. This is the most simple way. I get a lot of people that say they think this is cheating. They might as well just use their iPhone, and I know it might feel that way, but especially if you're buying one of these newer, more complicated cameras, even if you're buying one of the more basic, I'd say entry-level cameras, but it's one from this year, or even the last couple years, the auto intelligence on these cameras is phenomenal. And the camera will do so much of the work for you. Your job is really just to make sure that what's in the frame of the camera is pleasing to your eye and it looks nice. That's your main concern. So for you, it's that one. Yeah, so it's IA. Yeah. So for some cameras, and Panasonic's one of those, it'll say intelligent auto, so it'll do the IA on there. But yeah, by keeping it on that setting, the camera's going to do the majority of the work for you. You're just focusing on what you see in the frame and making sure that looks nice. So that's the best way to get started. A lot of these cameras too, after you've taken your image, There's another button I'll show you on here where you can actually see what the camera decided to do with all your settings. It'll show you the shutter speed, the ISO, and the aperture on there, so you can then kind of dictate and use that for future. Mode dial to go through that for you so you're not left wondering. Every camera's mode dial is going to be different. You've got the IA on there, some of you have the green camera symbol, which will mean automatic, and some of you it might say AI on there as well, or IA. This is what the majority of all cameras will look like. So you're going to see that certain cameras, older models, will have this old one called Scenes on there. None of you guys have that, so I'm not going to go through that right now. If anybody online has those, I can mention all of that for you. But this is majority of what you're going to see. So go into the next slide. Your auto, or A+, that's auto control over all settings and functions of the camera. Really the only thing you're going to be able to fiddle with is your focus area on that camera. And even then, for the majority of it, the camera is going to produce most of the focus for you. So you really don't have to do anything when you're on the automatic setting other than frame. M is full manual control over the camera's arrays and functions. I definitely would recommend, before you even try to use manual control, you try to learn the two just below it first, because those are going to give you kind of like a taste to manual. They're going to allow you to set certain parts of the camera, but then it's going to let the camera be automatic throughout the rest of it. So what I mean by that is aperture priority controls the iris of the camera. When you look at your own eyeball, you've got that little black part on there, and then you've got the color of your eye. Depending on when you get into light or into non-light situations, that iris expands or closes based on the amount of light that the human eye needs to see things. So the darker things are, the more open your iris becomes, because your eye wants to let in the most amount of light possible. And when we're outside in the sun, not wearing any sunglasses, our iris is going to get the smallest possible. And that's because we've got so much light coming in, the eye doesn't need that much to see things, so it kind of makes itself smaller. The camera does the same thing, except in the camera world with aperture, it's depth of field as well as light that's coming into it. So there's a couple things you have to keep in mind with that. Shutter priority, or S or TV if you will, and I can't honestly tell you why it's TV. I've been trying to figure that out for a little bit. I know I Googled it at one point, there's a reason for it. But A or AV for aperture, and S or TV for shutter. Shutter is basically going to control the speed at which the shutter is closing and getting the image. For something like everyday photography, if let's say we want to capture maybe myself, I'm just standing right here. You don't need a very fast shutter speed in order to do that, because I'm a still non-moving thing. So something maybe like a 1/100th of a speed. Also, the numbers that you see when you're setting the shutter, it's all of a second. So when they're showing you that number, they'll basically say 1 over 100. That means that it's 100th of 1 second that it's capturing that image. That's where math kind of comes into it. But basically, the higher that number goes, the faster it's going. The smaller that number goes, the slower it's going. The slower you have it going, the more detail it's going to capture. But then at the same time, if your item or object moves at all, you'll get blurry. The faster it goes, the less amount of light that comes in, so the darker the image gets, but the faster you're going to be able to capture a shot. We talk more about this in the intermediate class, but those are what those two settings are going to be doing on the camera. And I definitely would recommend playing with those two first before you move into manual, just to familiarize yourself with changing those dials and learning how to respond as you see things change around you. P stands for program, and program can basically do anything that you want. Aperture and shutters can be on auto, but everything else is changeable. For everything on the camera, you can change it, but the nice thing with program is, let's say that you had your ISO automatic, your shutter automatic, and you were doing your aperture at maybe a 2.8 or a 4 the entire time. Every time you go back to program, it'll always stay on those exact same settings that you left off on. When you bounce to everything else, it's going to change based on how you're changing, or based on how the camera's intelligent auto is reading the scene that you're in. So program is a nice way, if there's a certain setting or a certain maybe feature that you like about the camera, you move to program and it'll always stay like that unless you physically change it. On the camera too, you might also see C1 or C2 on your dial. Those are customizable dials and they're almost identical to program. Then B is also fully customizable, but B stands for bulb. And the idea behind that was way back in the day, you'd have your camera, this guy would throw a towel over his head, hold this thing up, and you'd get this really obnoxious thing of light that would flash off. It would be a spark of some sorts. Bulb is what that was. It would be a bulb that would flash off like that, and I believe in the 40s and in the 50s, and then into 60s and 70s, they had a physical blue light bulb that would go on there and it would crackle after it would shoot. But before that, in the 30s and in the late 1800s, they used a powder. Powder would then ignite, cause this flash, and that's how you would get light on your image. Within the digital aspect of the camera, they've taken bulb and they've made it to be wide open. So bulb is basically your long exposure. So for as long as you're holding the shutter release button, some cameras will have it that once you click the shutter release, you gotta click it again and then it'll close the shutters. But for super long exposures, to get the most detail on the camera, if you've got a tripod set up, that's where you can use the bulb setting. Some cameras will have this on their mode dial, some cameras won't. If you don't, then it's in your shutter speed is where you're able to then pull the bulb setting up. Scenes on there basically stand for automatic modes. Most mirrorless cameras are not going to have this, but basically what this meant was that back in the day when you had your DSLR, let's say you were doing nighttime photography, you could use this symbol over there, and it was meant to trigger the camera to specifically take pictures made for nighttime. The little running person was made for sports photography, the close-up flower was your macro photography, the mountain was your scenery, and then you had the face, which would have been portrait, CA was another customizable automatic, and then you had the little lightning bolt, the line going through it, which meant no flash. Nowadays, the automatic that you have on there, the IA, the green camera, the AI, those are going to be the same thing as scenes. They just have realized that the camera's smart enough that it can dictate the shot for itself. We don't need to have all these extra dials on there to confuse people. So you won't see that on new mirrorless cameras. I'd say if you've got a camera that's maybe 2015 or older, that's where you might see these dials on there.
What are the little random ones? This is an R7, so like there's three things that like kind of all look alike. They're like icons, but they don't really like. I had a Nikon D7 before, you know, so it had that similar dial.
The C2, C3.
Oh, is that what they are?
Yeah, those are your customizables.
Oh, so that's what it's
Yep.
saying, C2. Oh,
Yep. So now
I was looking at it as an image instead of as a C2.
So yeah, if it says the C on there, those are customizable. So you can do whatever you want with those, and every time you go back, it should automatically leave off right where you left them. From the side of the camera now, so most mirrorless cameras won't have a flash on there anymore. The reason being is that the sensor is so strong, it's almost triple the amount of ISO that was on DSLRs. So where the DSLR flash would have been a nice little light to light up your subject matter, most mirrorless cameras don't need that amount of light anymore, and if they do, it's going to be something greater than what the little puny flash on the camera would have been able to do. So if your mirrorless has no flash on there, it's not the fact that they forgot it for whatever reason, it's the fact that your camera's powerful enough that if it did need a flash, the little flash that would have been on the camera would not have worked for the power that your camera exudes. Function button on there, so when you click the FN button on your camera, that should open up a menu system, and that should then change or allow you to edit the function of the camera. So that's where you can usually change your focusing area, you can change your metering mode, you can change a few of the other settings on the physical camera at a quick glance. That's what the FN button will do. Underneath that, depending on the lens that you're using, if you have a prime lens, this won't really affect you. But if you have a zoom lens, which would be a telephoto, so anything with a variable number on there, in this case we have a kit lens on my Nikon, which would be an 18 to 55. So the zoom ring would basically control the 18, and if we wanted to zoom up to 55 millimeters, that's what we would use it for. With most cameras, unless you're shooting with a Leica M11, you're going to have the ability to switch between focus automatic or focus manual. The focus ring on the very front of the lens, and for some lenses this will differ, but traditionally speaking in cameras, your focus ring is in the front of the lens, and if you have an aperture ring, it could be on the back of the lens. This camera doesn't have an aperture ring, so we're not going to worry about that. But a focus ring would basically be what it says it is. Depending on the way that you turn the focus ring, you can manually focus on a subject matter. Where this really comes into effect, or where it's really positive to use that, is if you're shooting video. When you're shooting video on a camera, you're not necessarily allowing the camera to focus in on one subject matter, because if you move the camera, it's going to refocus and it could mess up your whole shot. What you'd probably want to use is a manual focus so that you yourself can dictate whether or not the thing that you're filming is in focus, or what's in the background is now in focus, or what's in the foreground now is in focus. The focus ring gives you control over that, whereas automatic focus, depending on the setting you have on the camera, will either focus on the target that you're picking or things around the target that you're picking, but it can fluctuate. Lens button. Again, certain cameras will have this, but I typically tell people that if you have an older model camera that doesn't necessarily have like an AI functionality on there, the camera itself is pretty basic, or the lens itself is basic. So there's not really any components on the inside that can, let's say, hold the lens in place. You've got to pull that switch down and then turn it.
I have read a couple things about like if you're using these with the adapter on the older
Yeah.
and that there can be a
moments.
fair amount of noise and things that are kind of exacerbated in the pixels. And I don't know if you've heard that from people. I'm just curious.
It can happen. There's
Yeah.
not much you can do around that. It's all dependent on the quality of the glass from that old one. If you're using some of the higher end like L series lenses with that adapter, usually there's little to none. But if you're using some of the cropped lenses, or you're using more of the kit lenses with that variable aperture, you might start to notice that. Vignettes are very popular around there. You get that little black ring that goes around the image, and it's only a circle that's clear. Sometimes you'll notice where you'll try to go to your maximum f-stop, and because the lens is crop sensor on a full frame, or vice versa, it'll only let you go to like a 4, even if your lens says it can go all the way to 2.8. So there are instances with that. Canon and Nikon continue to try to work on ways to fix that.
Well, what you just said makes a lot of sense. I read that stuff, so
Yeah.
obviously if it's
Yeah,
technology's gone.
that's the only downside to it. The new series that they have for the mirrorless is fantastic, but they really made it where if you bring it over and you use that adapter, most likely if you had the highest end glass for your old cameras, it's going to work amazingly. But if for any reason you had lesser glass and you bring it over to this new spanking awesome system, it might give you a couple issues. Yeah. From there you have then your lens release button. All cameras that are going to have interchangeable lenses will have this. Typically you'll hold the button in, turn counterclockwise, clockwise. Clockwise. You're going to turn clockwise, and then that will remove the lens from the bayonet system. Then all you got to do is place it back on, twist. You don't have to hold the button again, but once you start twisting on there, you'll hear a click. That's how you know the lens is then locked into place on the bayonet system. Typically, there's going to be little dots on your lens and on the camera body. Right there, there's a little white dot, and then on the opposite side, where we would align the camera and that up, you'll see another white dot. By then twisting that, you'll hear a click. That's how you know it's locked into place. To remove, hold the button, and twist the opposite direction. It pops right off. Underneath that, we have a drive mode button. Now, a lot of the times I'm noticing on newer cameras, this is going to be on the top of your camera, but on this model, it's on the bottom. You're going to see two shapes or two symbols on there. One will be a stacked thing of squares, and then another one is going to be a little like timer. That is basically your camera's ability to either take a single shot, burst shots, or a timed image. If you want to set a 3-second timer, a 10-second timer, a 30-second timer, or if, let's say, you're at a sporting event and there's somebody who's going to be running into the end zone for a touchdown, you're probably not going to want to take one picture. You probably want to take multiple to make sure you get them in clearness. That's where then you can use the drive mode button and dictate how the camera is shooting. Am I doing a timed image? Am I taking 20 images? Or am I taking one standalone still? Back view of the camera, you've got your menu button. Now, this is something I've recently learned on Canon specifically. Depending on your menu, if you are in the automatic setting, you are going to have a limited access to your menu. If you are then in manual or aperture priority or shutter priority or basically anything that's not automatic, you will then have more access to the menu stuff. So depending on what you're driving your camera with, that's going to dictate what you have accessibility to in your menu. So keep that in mind when you're trying to change settings. If you're changing something and you notice that I don't see that on there when you're trying to change it, it might be because of what you have your camera set to on the mode dial. And I noticed that with Canon, but I'm almost positive that goes for all other brands. So keep that in mind. If there's a setting you're trying to change in the menu and you don't see it or don't have visibility to it, it might be whatever you have your camera set to as far as the mode. Diameter adjustment on there for any of us 4-eye people. If you are looking through your viewfinder on the camera, just like a pair of binoculars, you might notice that it's blurry, it doesn't look right. There's a little dial on the side of the camera, and that's for the diameter. That'll change the glass on the inside so it's closer or further away. So depending on how you see, you can then edit that. People will ask me if they should use their glasses or not. I say do it to your comfortability. The camera is going to kind of act like your glasses would, where when you start to zoom in and focus, it's going to focus itself, it's going to fine-tune itself. So in theory, you should be able to shoot a good picture in full clearness with no glasses on. However, I haven't been to the eye doctor in a very long time. I'm ashamed to admit that, but I don't really trust my eyes without my glasses on, so I do use my viewfinder with my glasses. I put it right up to the viewfinder. I look silly doing it, but I would rather do that to make sure I see everything than then go back through and edit photos and find out I took all of my photos slightly blurry. Info button. So that was the button I was telling you earlier about. There's another button called image playback. So one of the things I tell people in this class, that's one of my favorite things to do. Canon does this specifically, and I don't remember if Nikon or Sony do, or Lumix, unfortunately. But let's say you take a picture on automatic, and you are like, this is the best picture I've ever taken, I love it, what did my camera do? You can hit the playback button, so it should be a little square with a triangle in it, and then whatever image that you see that you like, press the info button. From there, not only should it tell you the time and the date you took the photo, but it should then break down the aperture, the shutter speed, the ISO, all of the finer details that basically would have been controlled on a manual shutter or aperture priority. So that I've been using that to kind of help students figure out, okay, I had a lot of sun coming down, there was no overcast. My camera decided to do shutter 1/100, with the ISO being 400, and it did it with an aperture of 4. Well, why did it do all that? And it kind of helps you dictate and understand, well, there was this much light coming in, my subject wasn't moving. Okay, that makes more sense. So for the person who's just trying to gather themselves to figure out why it is that a camera does what it's doing on automatic, that's a great way to kind of gauge yourself and understand it a little bit better. For those that are past that point, then I would recommend looking at it and figuring out why it doesn't look the way it looks like in real life. That's kind of the name of the game with everything. The info button helps with that. Focus and exposure lock on there. The best way I can describe this is, let's say you focus in on a subject matter, like let's say I'm focusing in on my first student here. I can focus in and press that button. It'll lock into place with exactly where they're at, and if I shift over, it's going to keep that focus kind of in a line. So it's nice if, let's say, you're doing maybe product photos. I've had people that sell on eBay all the time, or they got their small business. They'll line up a bunch of things that they're trying to take pictures of, and what they'll do is they'll press that exposure lock, and they'll basically just shuffle themselves over. And what they're doing is they're allowing the camera to stay locked in and focused in with whatever settings they have set up, but no matter which way they move, it's going to keep exact focus with where it's lined up at. So it's measuring the distance between you and that item. So if, let's say that you now back up or you move forward, you're most likely going to knock out the focus that was being had. So now it's either going to be past it or before that, depending. Image playback, we talked about that. The I button is also another form of menu or function. Some cameras, the I button is actually the function button. So it's always nice to double check. Sometimes it'll take you into an advanced setting too, where it lets you set the I button as a customizable. But all cameras, their I button will be slightly different. Underneath that, we have the OK and the multi-selector. This is kind of like your keypad, if you will, or it's like your little your arrows on your computer, if you will. That's going to be your way of navigating through the menu, scrolling through, and then the OK button is obviously your enter button or your finalize button. From there, you have your magnifier and demagnifier. What I like to use that for is if I'm taking photos, and let's say I want to verify my photo that it looks sharp, it's in full detail, and nothing's blurry. What I'll do is I'll use the magnifier button in the playback section of the camera, and I'll actually zoom into my photos that I've already taken just to see if they look pixelated or blurry. That tells me a couple different things, but it makes sure that I'm taking quality images, or do I need to readjust my settings? Every year I volunteer for the Chicago Polar Plunge. I take photos in there, so I have to get in the lake while people are jumping in. As that's happening, people splash, and I have to keep a rag next to me so I can continuously wipe the lens as that water freezes over on the camera. One of the things I do is as I'm shooting, I'll hit the playback button and start zooming in real quick to see, because even if there's just a little speck of water on the corner, that'll be blurry when it starts to blow up. So that tells me right away if I have any issues with my lens, any purity problems, do I need to take my screen protector or my lens protector off. That's my way of using it. But the magnifier, demagnifier, it's a great way for you to look into your images, make sure everything looks sharp, and that you're not maybe being blurry in certain areas or pixelated in others or noise. It's all important. And then the delete button is all around there too. Delete button should look like a garbage can with its lid above it. You can delete your images from your camera right from there, but I recommend take as many pictures as you can when you're out doing stuff. Delete them on your computer. It'll be easier on the computer to delete, but then it also gives you the chance of seeing the bigger image on the screen. What might not look good on the camera might look just fine on the computer. I will say the newer mirrorless cameras, their LCD touchscreens are phenomenal. Some of them are even turning into OLED ones that's supposed to be coming soon. But at the end of the day, your computer has more pixels, it has a bigger screen, it has a finer way of seeing detail. I definitely would not recommend deleting photos on your camera. Just put them all onto the computer, delete from there, and pick and choose. It'll make your life easier. When you have the camera and the SD card, your job should just be to keep shooting pictures. Use the playback button to look at your images to make sure that the photos you're taking look nice. But you don't necessarily have to waste your time sitting there and delete for the images that you don't like, especially if you have a 32 or 64 gigabyte SD card. 64 with a 20 megapixel camera is still about 9,000 images. So,
Is the asterisk button on the R7, is that the demagnify?
let's take a look.
I'm assuming that's magnify. Is that demagnify?
That might be here. Let's flip your screen open. Let's see. So in this case, what it's doing is it's removing all of the squares around this guy.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily doing that. Your demagnifier and it might not actually be
Single. I mean, there's a lot that goes on here with these menus too.
and
so.
that's the other thing with this guy. The thing with this one is that there's probably no demagnifier on your
Yeah.
camera. What it's going to be is your 2-finger pinch, because
Got
that's a
it.
touch screen as well too.
Okay.
This guy is basically going to eliminate the boxes around your physical camera, so then that takes
Okay.
everything away, so you have more viewing
So
space on the
space.
LCD screen.
Yeah.
But then this button right here is then going to let you then pick and choose, so
Got
you
it.
can do the focusing via
Yep.
your fingers.
Yep. Perfect.
So yeah,
Nice.
again, some of the menu stuff on there is going to be in the physical camera nowadays.
Yeah.
Canon's a big proprietor of that. Other menus are going to stay on the buttons. But now, especially since cameras have touch screens on there, that wasn't a thing before like 2016, 2017. Now that almost every camera does, a lot of the stuff that we just talked about, you'll probably see on the inside of the camera.
Yeah, I haven't had a lot of time to play with it yet, so I was just curious. Did you know that already?
I show this to everybody because I think this is really important. My camera doesn't work, and then people show me this picture. Your camera does. It is not the baseball player, or it's not the bat, it's the baseball player. It is not the camera, it is you. Again, stick to using automatic, play with it. I definitely always recommend automatic, and I know it seems like it's cheating. It's, you bought this camera, you want to learn how to use it. It's like when you first pick up guitar or a musical instrument, you could sit there and strum away at it all day until you actually put the time and the practice into it. It's not going to sound any better than that. Photos are going to be the same way. Until you take that, 4,000th photo, it just still won't make sense. So keep practicing, keep playing with it. Another thing to remember too is your camera isn't a smartphone. I had someone today call me and she was looking for a camera for vlogging. She wanted to start a makeup channel on YouTube. Everything was great, but then she started naming features that were more particular to the phone, and I had to explain, well, no, that's not really something the camera does, and it's not because the camera can't do it, it's because that's mainly a phone feature. It's not something that the camera would necessarily do. So holding the two in the same kind of ballpark, your camera is going to be a better version of what your phone can do. Typically your phone can take a nice portrait, it can take a clean image, but it doesn't really get a lot of zoom. It doesn't get the megapixel quality, and it doesn't have the ability to blow it up, to make it bigger or do something with it. That's where the phone becomes limited. And that's where then the next step to get a camera was. For most people, I would say buying a camera, they look at their phone, they're like, this is great, but like, what's the next step? What can I do more with that? And that's kind of where you guys are at with then getting a real camera or moving up. So keep that in mind. Next thing we talk about a little bit, might seem silly, but it's holding the camera. Anybody who does an art, whether it's painting, drawing, that's my main practice that I do. I do photography, I'd say third in my art world. Anybody who does this kind of stuff, you are asking for arthritis, carpal tunnel, other back problems. There's so many things that can come about with this kind of stuff because of the positioning we have to put ourselves in to get the shot. So it's important that when we're shooting with this, we remember a couple different rules. One of the things I like to talk about is your back and your elbows. Your back should be as straight as possible, and I think she does a really good job of doing that. You can lean backwards to get shots, you can lean forward to get shots, but remember that it's your back in the long run that's going to keep you in the game of taking photos, and if you injure your back, then you've got to figure out a way of like holding the camera in your lap, which would be no fun. So keeping a straight back, avoid having bad posture at all times. It'll help, the lower parts of your back. It'll help the shoulders out a lot. The elbows, though. I like to talk about the elbows because I think a lot of the people that I see with cameras, you can wing out, and there's really not going to be any bad parts of doing that, except for the fact that people can knock into you, which number one could put the camera at risk, especially if you put a couple thousand into the camera. You want to make sure it doesn't fall or break. But then two, it screws up your imagery. The more that you have your elbows out, the more wiggle wobbly you are, and the more of a chance you have to kind of shuffle around and take a lesser quality image. Use your elbows as like a deck, how did I word this before? It's like a deck foundation. When you look at a deck or a balcony, you're going to notice that there are slanted pieces of wood that are helping keep the deck up. I think that your arms should be doing the same with the camera. You also, for the most part, have a camera strap around the camera, and that should be around your neck. What I like to recommend is pull on the camera strap so it's taut around your neck, lock your elbows into your rib cage and almost use that as then your foundation. You're keeping it nice and taut with your neck, but then you're also using your elbows to lock into your body. And you kind of look like you're a little bit awkward with it, but as long as you keep your posture with your back, you're limiting the chance that people have of bumping into you. You also now have more stability under your arms, so less of a shake. If you're not someone who likes using tripods or monopods or carrying extra gear or bulk with you, it might seem kind of funny to lock your arms at first like this, but the more time that you practice with it, then number one, the less shaky you'll be, but then two, the less that you'll notice people won't be bothering you, bumping into you, or knocking you as they're trying to get around you as you're doing photos. Focus, then shoot, and shoot through the whole photo. One of the things that I see a lot of people struggle with is they see one aspect of their photo that they want to capture, and they focus on one thing, neglecting the rest of their photo, leaving them with less than desirable photos. When you're shooting, look at the entire image plane that you're taking. You should be looking at the foreground, the front, the foreground, the background, your negative space. You should be looking at horizon lines, subject matter. This is all stuff we're going to talk about in the next couple slides. But the main idea is that you're not focusing on one aspect of your photo. You have to focus on the bigger picture of it and shoot through. You can always edit, change the colors, adjust, edit things out, and nowadays too with AI being where it's at with Photoshop and stuff. I saw a video the other day. This gentleman got a picture of a guy on a bicycle in Italy, and he had a car next to him. There was a stop sign on one of the corners. He was able to circle all of that and just tell the computer to remove it. The photo looked incredible. Didn't look like it was edited at all, but all he had to do was just tell it what he didn't want to see. So you can change photos, you can edit things, things can be changed, but that primary image, if it looks bad, it's going to still look bad, no matter what you do to it. If your camera's moving, you're going to get blurry photos. That's kind of the only way to talk about that. Some people make an entire career off that, which can be really cool. But other times, it's just going to look what you see on the left, which if you went to Paris and that was the image you brought back, I'd be disappointed in you. But again, if you're someone who, this is uncomfortable holding the camera, look into a monopod, look into a tripod. You can get very cheap aluminum ones. You can also get really expensive carbon fiber ones that are even lighter than aluminum. There's a whole different route that you can go with them. But again, if your camera's moving, you're going to get blurry images. Doesn't matter how much image stabilization is in the camera. Doesn't matter how expensive the camera is. That's just the way that that goes. Now these are some of the basic rules that I've learned through college, through schooling, and even through my own art practice. This is what I recommend to people to pay attention to. There are certain things I'm going to talk about, and then there are certain things I'm going to basically go back on. So the way that I'd like to describe all this stuff is this is the basics that I think that you need to taking great photos, but like all rules, like all basics, they can always be broken. You can always change things around, you can always do things differently. One of the first rules that I like to play by is fill the frame. So on the photo on the left compared to the right, we have this headshot most likely being used for a resume, maybe being thrown on to apply for acting or screen guild jobs. But you have the image on the left compared to the image on the right. The image on the left has all of these harsh shadows that we're getting from the wall. We have a direct sunlight or direct light coming in from the left side, and we're getting these shadows on the left side of the wall where the molding comes in. By cropping in on the image and eliminating that, we now focus on the main subject matter, which is just the headshot. We're filling the frame, we're eliminating the negative space in the image, and we'll refer to that as negative space because it's non-directing or non-impactful to our subject matter. So the negative space in the image, we've cropped in on that, and we focused in on the main point of the subject matter, cleaning the image up, making it a little bit more presentable. Another thing that we could do is make sure that the eyes are in the top third of our image. If we look at an image, we can break it into, I'd say, 9 or 6 different quadrants. Yeah, 6 different quadrants. So you can do the top, the bottom, and you've got the middle, and then you've got the top. You've also got the right, the center, and the left. So in this case, we basically have it where his, I would say, the left eye, because he's on a slight slant, is just at about that third line, if not a little bit above it. From there, what we're getting is if we can keep the eyes in the top third, naturally as humans, we like to travel and we like to read images, kind of like we read things on a paragraph, but it's a little bit different because our eye travels from either most stimulating to most negative or most negative to most stimulating. One of the things that humans do naturally is we like to make eye contact with photos. So if you can get the eyes of the image into a certain section, we're more drawn to that. The eyes being at the more top third, we're naturally going to go to the top of the image and then read down. The other way you might read this is with the pink shirt. It's a very bright, vibrant shirt, and we kind of lock onto that as well too, depending on the rest of the image. But the eyes are big. Focusing in on the eyes have a nice effect. That gateway to the soul stuff that they always talk about, I know that that seems silly, but humans, we like the color of eyes. They're sometimes one of the most fascinating parts of the human body. And you really can tell a whole story with that. When you look at all three of these images too that I've just shown, everything for the most part has the eyes in the top third. And that's also natural because when you look at someone's head, their eyes are majority in the top of the head. So another thing that you can do is getting on the level of the subject matter of what you're taking photos. And kid photos, I think this is one of the best that you can kind of show the example because they're all tinier humans. But when you shoot, you create a hierarchy scale. You being the top and them being below you in a sense. So when you're taking photos, you're shooting down at them, which can seem fine to your eyes, but to viewers' eyes, this would be nothing more than just a simple shot, maybe just something for their scrapbook. But if you're trying to add a little bit more flair to it and add a little bit more artistic value, dropping down to the level that the kids are at and making them kind of in the main center of the imagery. We can see in this case, the little boy's eyes are kind of not in the third part of the photo. When we get to that top third, I would say maybe this eye is cutting through, but his eyes are very present. They're one of the first things that we lock onto. His sister or his friend in the background, her eyes are in the top third, so we have that there too. But by getting on their main focus, we've then taken the image that could be something like this, where we're getting the entire party, we're getting the group of people, but now we're starting to focus in on maybe one or two different people or subject matters, and then on top of that too, we're making sure that we get on their level so that way we're not making them feel smaller than us. We're not creating this hierarchy complex in a negative way. We can though, however, also create the hierarchy complex in a positive way. With kids especially too, by putting them at the more elevated point of the photo, so keeping their heads more in the top portion of the picture, trying to keep within that top third or maybe even middle section of the image. We've now created it where the kids almost have this sense of looking down at us, gives them more power, gives your subject more power, can lead to a more interesting photo. Going back into those quadrants, there are intersecting points at all of the different quadrants, and we call that the rule of thirds. If you can keep your image on that line and you're crossing that third or that section of the line, then you're following within the rule of thirds. That's going to create a more pleasing and what's the word I'm looking for? Just pleasing image, if you will. Again, the idea is that when you're showing people your pictures, you can take your pictures for just yourself, but if you're trying to show these off, what separates your pictures from somebody else's? How is an artist looking at photos when they're taking pictures? Nothing is done by accident, and I think that's something to keep in mind too. Artists, photographers, anybody who creates something, they have an intention for every little detail that's on that picture. And that's kind of the way that you should be thinking about it. It doesn't necessarily have to be that thought-provoking or deep, but when you're taking the photo, it's nice to keep some of these in mind. So I'm going to throw in a couple different pieces of vocabulary for this one as well too. But here we have our surfer dude. Our surfer dude is on the right part of the rule of thirds. Not only is the physical surfer crossing, but so is their shadow. So we have a nice stimulating picture because we're really hitting evenly on the rule of thirds, and it's maybe thought-provoking, but it definitely gets the mind going a little bit when you're reading the image. On top of that too, when we have then our other quadrants on there, so top, middle, and bottom. On the middle part, on the very top, we have a perfect horizon line. And a horizon line is where our background meets our foreground. In this case, water shows it one of the best because we can visibly see where our background meets meets our foreground, and then at what point that we get to see. So in this case, we have the sun in the background. We can see where the horizon line is, and this other line on the very top of our rule of thirds is dividing it almost perfectly. We have the nice light coming on the foreground there. We've got our rule of thirds here, but the other thing that's really nice too is that we have a shadow being cast from our surfer because the sun is behind. There's a couple different rules of thoughts with the sun. We'll talk about that in the next, in a couple slides. But with lighting, you can keep the light on the back of you, and you can allow it to either offer more exposure or no exposure. You can typically get or lend the photo a little bit more, what's the term I'm looking for, like creative pizzazz, if you will. In this case, because the sun is behind them, we're cutting off the amount of light that comes through, so we darken up the surfer, but we're concentrating the light behind him. On top of that too, the way that the reflection comes off between his feet, it's just very eye-catching. Same thing can be said with this. There's a lot of beach photos, don't know why. In this case, on the very far left, now we're on the opposite side of our rule of thirds, our little girl, her ankle and her shoulder are perfectly in line with our 2 points of the third. And then on top of that too, that horizon line cuts right at the top part there. We've divided our background and our foreground. We have light coming through the clouds, and we can tell that there has to be some sort of light out there because this looks very washed out in light. As you're cutting across, you can see some rays come through. So you can tell that it's overcast even though it's black and white. But what's, again, stimulating about it, you've got really nice contrast between your darks and your lights. Oh, my battery should be fine, hopefully. You've got really nice light between everything there. You've got good shadow coming through. You're on that rule of thirds, so again, stimulating image, more positive. Again, yeah. This is a double rule of thirds one, but this just kind of shows that symmetry between the two. I always tell this to people, but the one thing that can make it better is if the mom and the dad moved over slightly, then they would be perfectly on that line. But you kind of get the picture of where we're going with this. The brother and the sister, or at least the son and the daughter, the two friends, they're holding hands, but they're perfectly in line. And then moving over on the right side, we have the mom and the dad, or the husband and wife, or the friends. They're together as well too. So you've got a nice symmetry matching on the two there. But by hugging those two lines, you're adding in more dimension to the photo, and you're framing it in a way that makes it more stimulating for the viewer that's going to look at it. Now this one breaks my rule of thirds slightly, but I like to use it because, again, I wanted to throw in there that any of these rules can be broken. The Office did a really good job of utilizing the rule of thirds, but they broke my first rule, saying fill the space. By not filling the space, if you've watched The Office, you know that this is the conference room. There's the shrub over there, and then the blinds. But within doing that, it's going to give you the idea of where they're at, you know, in location as far as where they're showing the characters at, number one. Number two, by keeping those at that level, it's more stimulating. You know that they're interviewing the person. You know that they're talking. His eyes are in the top third. You travel to his face. He's a good-looking guy. So it shows it off in a way where they're giving the best features of the character with the area the character is in to give you context clues. So again, the rules I talk about, they can be broken. They can be followed to a T. Everyone can do them a little bit differently. But if you can try to do it a little bit, you'll start to notice that a lot of your favorite images and things that you're seeing follow similar rules to this. Talk about the sun on your back. This one always confuses people, but the bad image versus better. So that first image that we saw of our surfer dude where the sun was behind him, it cast a really dark shadow over that person, but it made it more visually stimulating. In this case, we have almost the same thing. This person is closed up, they're not open, and so because of that, the light that's coming through doesn't bounce or reflect off anything, and with that, we get a dark, closed-off image. By this gentleman moving over slightly to the side, you can see the ray of light cut through, hitting the fish. The fish has gills, it's got some slime to it, so it's going to be a little bit more light-oriented. On top of that, too, now that our person is now more open to the camera, that light that's coming in is going to bounce off him. The hat is kicked up a little bit more, so we have more light hitting our subject matter, adding a little bit more illumination to the whole thing. So keeping the sun on your back can be good, but it also can be bad, and using the sun to better your images, the more light the better. You can always go back in and edit light out.
Do you have kind of a weird question?
Yeah.
I read about the mirrorless with the sun, and since it doesn't have the mirror, they said you have to be careful with sensor burn. How worried do you have to be about that?
Honestly, I mean, it's really dependent on what you're doing. If you're taking pictures where you are facing the sun exactly, that's where I definitely would want to be worried about that. It's very similar to though to like TVs, with image burn on TVs. The more that you like play the news, for example, the more that CNN logo stays on the bottom right of your TV, the more of a chance it has to burn into that spot,
Okay,
because
so
it's.
taking a sunset picture is fine, it's just don't put it on a long
I wouldn't do it on
exposure.
a long exposure, and be
Okay.
careful of doing that if you do multiple long exposures over, let's say, a period of a year. Maybe you're doing like, oh, I want to do a beautiful sunset photo for every country I'm visiting in
Right.
summer. There's a possibility that then,
Okay.
yeah, after a full summer of doing that, you're going to see some type
I
of
was just
burn.
freaked out about that.
At least in the, knock on wood, I've been shooting on mirrorless for a long time now, for probably a good 10 years. My camera's hitting about the 10-year mark. No image burn on mine, no nothing. I take sunset pictures, I take moon pictures. I live in Chicago, so I'll be downtown all the time, bright lights and stuff, and no burns on my camera.
So be sensible.
Yeah, be sensible with it. I wouldn't, again, worry